Picking the right API access layer for your React application can be tough. So let's take a look at two of the top contenders. We have Redux Toolkit Query, and we're going to compare that to React Query. So let's jump right in and build us a to-do list application. As if you've never seen one of those before, you can go and say that a to-do item is done or not done. You can delete a to-do item, and of course, you can add one. No problem. Cool. So let's jump over into our VS Code and see how this is actually working. So right now, all we have is the server. It's an SJS server. It's pretty simple stuff. There is a to-do module in there, and it basically does, it references the to-do controller, which has a bunch of to-dos, and you can get the list of to-dos, get a particular to-do, post a to-do, and so on and so forth. And Nest.js makes it really easy to go and build a REST API like this. So we're not all that interested in the API, right? Let's go and build out our RTK query application. So the first thing I want to do is do yarn create and then React app. I'm going to say that this one is going to be called RTK to-dos, and we're going to give it a template of TypeScript. All right, application's all set up. Let's jump in that directory. And from there, I'm going to add a couple of dependencies. I'm going to add Redux. I'm going to add React Redux. And I'm going to add the Redux Toolkit, Redux.js/toolkit. And from there, I'm going to start up our application and see what we've got. Looks good. All right, let's jump back into our application and start hacking on this. I'm going to jump over into the source directory. And the first thing we're going to do is put in some new CSS. This is going to give us all that nice to-do CSS that we had before. And then let's go over into our app TSX. And I'm going to really pare this down. Okay, good to go. So let's take a look at what we've got on the page. A beautiful blank starting point. Awesome. So let's go create our store file, and this is going to hold our API access layer that's built using Redux Toolkit. Call this store.ts, and I'm going to import create API and fetch base query from the Redux Toolkit and the extension that they have on there, which is query and React. Now, query is the sort of larger query project, and then React is the specific bindings for React that give you the nice hook functionality that we're going to use. It's actually really cool. So the next thing we need to do is bring in the interface that defines the to-do. So a to-do has an ID, the text of the to-do, whether it's active or not in the database, and then whether it's done or not. And from there, I'm going to build out our API. So I'm going to use this create API function that we got. And it's giving me the red squigglies because there's a lot that I don't have in there. The first is the reducer path. So in Redux world, you're going to have multiple reducers that can sit on a single store, and we're going to call this one the to-do API. Next, we're going to define the base URL for this server, and that's on HTTP localhost 4000. And then we're going to define the invalidatable tags, and these basically define the kind of entity types within your system. So this, in this case, would just be a list of the to-dos. And now we get to the fun part where we define the endpoints that we're going to be talking to. So to define the endpoints, you give it a function, and that is given a builder. And that builder kind of works in conjunction with this fetch base query to build out get or post or put methods that then talk to that API endpoint. And the first one we want to do is get all the to-dos. So we're going to create the get all endpoint, and it's going to use builder.query to build out that query. And then we get into the TypeScript stuff where we say that we're going to get back a list of all the to-dos, and we're not going to send it any arguments. So that's going to be void. And then we're going to do the query. And so that's just going to add on to-dos onto the end of this localhost 4000. And interestingly, it's going to say, okay, well, I'm going to provide data. So data is coming out of this. I'm going to provide some invalidatable tags describing the pieces of data that I get back. And in this case, it's just the list of all the to-dos. So the type maps to this to-dos over here in the invalidatable tag types. And then you could have a list of all the IDs that you got back. Or in this case, I'm just going to say we want to make the entire list the thing that we're going to invalidate when we do something like put to update a to-do or post to create a to-do. But this should be good enough to just get us off the ground. So let's go back over into our app.tsx. So the first thing we're going to bring in is the API provider from that Redux toolkit. And that works in conjunction with RTK Query to provide the same way that a Redux provider would the API down to all of the hooks that we're going to use to make requests using those endpoints that we just created. So I'm going to change this and call this to-do app. And then I'm going to create a new function called app that returns the API provider around that to-do app. Looking good, but now we need to give it the API, right? So API is missing. So where do we get that from? Well, we're going to bring it in from that store where we defined it. So there we go, bring in that to-do API. And now we're going to connect it to our API. And away we go. Let's see if we're actually running. Still good. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is just go get that data using our freshly defined endpoint. The way that we do that is we use that to-do API. And it's created automatically a hook for us called use get all query. And why to give it that name? Well, that name comes from down here, get all. And so it's automatically generated a use get all query because this is a query. So we've done builder query, we're using get all, and it's kind of conjoined that all into that hook name. Nice, right? And now we're going to map the data that comes from that to to-dos. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes off of this, including whether it's loading, whether, all of the status, whether there's been an error and everything else. I'm just going to pull off the data. We're just going to do the happy path here. So I've got this to-dos, I've got the data, and now we just want to see it in our page. Let's do a JSON stringify and just dump the data in there and see what we get. Okay, done. Looking good. No, just kidding. Let's actually go and put a nice UI on this. All right, I'll take the files off and so we can see it a little bit better and then paste in our UI. Now let's take a look. All right, nice. Okay, so all it's doing here is just doing a standard map. It's going through all those to-dos. It's creating a React fragment for each one where you've got a checkbox, whether it's done or undone, got the text, and then you got a button. And currently these do nothing. So the next thing we need to do is implement on the checkbox here and get it to actually send updates to the store. So let's go back over into the store. And the first thing we need to do is create an endpoint for that. So we're going to bring in some code here. This one's called update to do. That's our endpoint. In this case, it's a mutation. It's not a query. It's going to change the state of the server. It's going to mutate it. And therefore, it's a builder.mutation. It's going to take a to-do and it's going to return a to-do. Now, the query here is constructed and you give it the URL. So in this case, it's to-do. And then whatever the ID is, the method we're going to put, which means change in REST land. And then we're going to give it the body, which is the to-do. We don't need to do any kind of JSON stringify or anything. It does all that for us. And then when it's done, when it succeeds, it then invalidates the tags of the to-do list, which means automatically it's going to rerun this get all query and update the page, which is just freaking awesome. So let's go back over here to app.tsx and get this all hooked up. So for this, I'm going to create a callback. I'm going to use callback here. And I'm going to bring in some code that uses that use callback. And this is on toggle. And it's going to use that use callback to then call update to do. And it's going to take a to do. And then it's going to set the new to do that's going to send off to update to do to have a flipped done state. And of course, it's going to depend on update to do. So we need update to do. So how do we go get that? Well, we bring that in using another hook. So here we go. We call use update to do mutation. Again, that's all concatenated by the endpoint names and the types that we gave it. And we're going to get back from that a tuple where the first element is that update. And then there's a subsequent object, which gives you all the status and everything else. So I'm not going to use any of that. Again, we're going to do the happy path on this one. So on toggle, let's jump down here and go over to our on change. And let's do on toggle and then give it the to do. All right, let's check it out and see if it works or not. Will it blend? All right, looking pretty good. Let's refresh. I love it. So easy. Okay, let's learn about how to do a delete since that's not going to work yet. So again, we'll go back over to our store. And of course, we need another mutation for this. So I'm going to drop that down in there. Again, it's going to take it to do, return it to do, and we're going to have the URL where it's, again, that same ID. But this time we're going to call the delete method. And that's really the difference in here. And then, of course, we'll invalidate that list. And that's going to then force an update of the total list. So let's go back over to our app. This time I'll bring in the hook first. So we'll bring in the delete mutation hook. And then I'll bring in the callback for onDelete, and jump down here and give it our to-do. Okay. And I don't want to learn Angular. How about that? How about I don't want to learn AWS? Boom. Okay, so the last thing we need to do in our RTK example is allow our customer to add a to-do to our to-do list. So let's go and add some UI for that. And I'll put it right down here at the end. It's going to have an input that has a ref on it and a button that says add that then calls on add. So first, let's get this text ref all straightened out. So the first thing I need back here is use ref. And then I need to define that text ref. And now, of course, we actually need to have something to call, but we don't have anything to call. So let's go back over into the store and create a new endpoint. So let's add a new endpoint called add to do. And this one is going to have the URL of /todos, but it's going to do a post. And then the body there is just going to be the text, right? That's all we need from this add is the piece of text. And that's going to go and then create a new to do for us. And again, it's going to invalidate that list. So go back over here to our app.tsx. Bring in our add to do mutation, and then finally define our callback on add, which is going to do an add to do with that current value. And let's actually add on to this a little bit. I'm going to go and also set that value to an empty string so that once it's done, we know it's good. Okay, great. Say refresh there, and I'm going to say add one. And we're added. Awesome. Cool. So that was a really quick walkthrough of how to use RTK Query. And before we jump into React Query, I just want to give you this opportunity to hit that like button if you like that video. And of course, hit that subscribe button if you really like the video and you want to see more advanced FE topics just like this one. Okay, let's go and build out our competitor, the React Query version. All right, jump back into our VS Code. And then I want to bring up our console. And then say, no, not anymore of that one. Let's go back and go up to the top level directory. And I'm going to, again, do that yarn create React app. And this time we're going to call it RQ to-dos and give it the template of TypeScript. Okay, looks like we're good to go. I'm going to jump into that directory. And then I'm going to add some dependencies. I'm going to add React Query. And I'm also going to add Axios. So why am I going to add Axios? Well, a viewer, Nick Pavlov, actually went through the effort of taking the original video that this is based on, which was a comparison of RTK Query versus Sagas, and said, hey, you really should do React Query. And he went off and did it. And then I sent me the code and I was like, well, that's really cool, but I hadn't used Axios in mind. So you know what? I'm going to use Axios as well. I thought that was really cool, but I am going to go and start with a simple fetch version start, and then we will then go and do the Axios version. So let's go and yarn start this up. All right, we've been there, seen that. So let's go down into here and start hacking. I'm gonna replace again all that CSS and go back over to our app and start hacking on that. Get rid of the logo, the header, all that. Cool. You know, the whole page is a header. That doesn't seem right. Okay, cool. So the next thing I'm gonna do is create a new folder. And I'm gonna call this lib for library. And then within that, I'm gonna create an api.ts file. And this is just going to have a bunch of utility functions for us. It's going to have the base URL of our to-dos service. It's going to have the definition of what a to-do is. And it's going to have some functions. Well, one is get to-dos, and it's going to be an async function that returns a promise to give us a bunch of to-dos. And all it's going to do is just fetch with that base URL and then get the response back in JSON. Why do we even have this in a template? That doesn't make any sense. Get rid of that. What are you thinking, Jack? Craziness. Okay, cool. So we have similar sort of things. We can also get an individual to do. We can create a to do, update a to do. And this is essentially just the same thing as before. The only little difference here is that I actually have to do the work of doing the JSON stringify as well as adding the content type for the headers to set it to application JSON, which you kind of need for REST stuff. So, okay, let's now we got that. Next thing we're going to do is bring in use query from React Query. And then from our API, we are going to bring in get to-dos. That's the first thing we need to do, as well as the definition for a to-do from that library. So the first thing we're going to do is use query to call that get to-dos and get our list of to-dos. So we use query. We tell it what the output type is. In this case, it's going to be an array of to-dos. You give it the data tag name. It's kind of similar from what we saw with RTK query. And then the method is going to go get it. So in this case, that's going to be our get to dos, as well as the initial set of data. So now let's see if we actually did get some data back by doing our JSON stringify trick. Always handy in a pinch. And now it's telling us that we don't have a query client. So we need to set a query client or have a query client provider. So let's go and do that. So I'm going to bring in query client provider and query client from React Query. Say that 10 times fast. And then I need to go and create a query client. That's just as easy as making a new one, just like that. And now we need to actually do that wrapping thing again. So let's do to-do app here. And then function app. And again, we're going to return that to-do app. But we are going to wrap it in a query client provider. But you know what? While we're here, I'm going to add the dev tools because I think they're really slick. So I'm going to bring in the React Query dev tools and then get that and put that in there as well. I always love when folks provide this kind of stuff. It's really nice. So let's go back over our page. And now we can see that we are getting that data because we got that provider. And we've also got our dev tools down here. That's really nice. Okay, so let's hit refresh and we can see that we got to-dos. We can see all the data that came back. Just really nice stuff. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is actually go and put a UI on it, right? All right, so let's get rid of this and bring in our UI and have a look. Okay, looks good. Cool. We're done. Nah, just kidding. Of course, so now we need to go and do our update over here. So the first thing we need to do is bring in our update to do. And then we need to bring in use mutation, because this is going to be mutation. It's going to change things. And then we'll bring in the code for update mutation, which is going to use mutation as opposed to use query. It's going to call that update to do. And then when it's successful, it's going to invalidate that to dos. This is going to, again, go and force it to redo that request. So now we need to call that update mutation. And we'll go over there to that on change. And let's have a look. It's going to call mutate on update mutation. And then it's just going to do that toggling there to get the done flag to toggle. All right, looking good. So the next thing we want to do is do the delete functionality. So again, we're going to bring in delete to do. And then we're going to create the delete mutation. Looking good. And finally, we want to go and call it. And I'm just going to give it the to-do. And let's see. Yep. Okay. Looking good. Nice. All right. So the last thing we need to do is go and add. So I'm going to bring in create to do. And I'm going to bring in the mutation for that. Very similar to what we had before, just calling create to do. And that's going to give us our create mutation. So of course we need some UI for that. Let's jump down here. All right. Let's add that UI. Cool, looking good. Of course, we're missing a ref, so let's bring in use ref and get that ref going. Now we've got a text ref. Very cool. All right, look great. Let's go and bring in our create to do function and create our create to do mutation. All right, we'll pop that in there, and that's just going to call that create to do and then invalidate the queries. So the last thing we need to do is just do that. So let's jump down here and then create mutation, mutate, and then give it the text ref, current value. And of course, we want to set that to nothing once we're done. Here we go. Okay, add to. Nice. All right, cool. But of course, as I mentioned previously, Nick gave me the great idea to use Axios here. So let's try that. Let's bring in Axios and use it instead of these verbs down here, like get to dos and so forth. So we need to set up an Axios client. So let's do that. And all we need to do is give it that base URL. And there you go. And let's just start kind of swapping these out one by one. So let's comment this out, the query to get the to-dos. And we'll bring in the Axios version of that. So it's going to use that Axios client to, again, get all those to-dos. And then it's going to get back the data from that after getting the await and finally getting the promise back and then resolving the promise, and we'll get the data off it. All right, let's go take a look. Nice. Okay, good. But I think the Axios stuff really starts to show when you do like other types of verbs like put and post. So let's comment out the update mutation that was the original one and then paste in the mutation for the Axios client. And this is going to use the put method as opposed to the get method. And I think that's actually where it's really nice. The other little change here is we're going to say unsettled, which means that regardless of the outcome of this, whether it's a success or a failure, then again, invalidate that query. I used unsuccess before. It's really just depends on the semantics that you're looking for. So I'll hit save there and we'll see if it works. Yeah, nice. Okay, very cool. Let's change out our delete mutation. And again, all we're going to do is just use Axios client, but in this case called delete with that URL. And I think, again, if we look over here at the lib version of that, so delete to do, 4 lines versus 1 line here. Nice trade-off. Let's see if it actually works. This time I don't want to learn Next.js. Okay, cool. All right, great. And then finally, let's do that create mutation. Again, comment that out. And then I'm going to bring in create mutation, and it's going to do the invalidation to queries. It's also going to set that text ref to nothing, so I can actually get rid of this one down here. But in this case, I actually want to send along the text, so I'm going to put in text in the object like that. And away we go. Let's take a look. Haha! Add 3. Awesome. Very cool. Okay, so there you go. A pretty decent to-do list battle between React Toolkit Query and React Query. So which one would I use? Well, it really depends on whether I'm using Redux or not. If I'm using Redux, I'm definitely going to be using Redux Toolkit and thus Redux Toolkit Query, which I think works really well. If I'm using basic React hooks and I'm not using Redux, well, React Query is a fantastic piece of work, and it's going to do a lot of the little edge casey stuff you're not going to get from some homegrown query library. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit that like button if you did. Hit the subscribe button if you really did. Click on the bell and you'll be notified the next time a new one of these comes out.